In June 2003, British conservationist Greg Rasmussen is flying solo in an ultralight plane in Zimbabwe, Africa. He has agreed to help a fellow conservationist and search for a lost rhinoceros. Greg had to be wary. He was flying over unfamiliar terrain and had to also be aware of poachers. An ultralight plane can be dangerous to fly in, particularly if it is a hot day, with the air potentially too thin to help keep the plane in the air. Flying over the harsh, dry and rocky terrain, Greg manages to locate the animal in good time. As Greg begins to leave the area, he started going into what is called a wing stall. This stall means that one wing is operating as normal, but the other one isn't. The plane starts nosediving and spiraling towards the ground at a rapid rate. Despite responding to the stall correctly, Greg quickly realizes the plane is going to crash and braces for impact. Greg is awoken to a liquid dripping on his face. He quickly realizes it is leaking petrol. Terrified of the crashed plane exploding, Greg threw himself off the plane and onto the ground. Unable to move his legs, Greg crawled away from the danger area. Then it dawned on Greg, nobody is going to know what has happened. He needs to return to the plane and send out a mayday. Reluctantly, Greg dragged himself back to the plane to make the distress call, terrified that the plane could explode at any second. Unfortunately, the handset had completely fried in the crash, rendering it inoperable. Following this, Greg's adrenaline started wearing off and is quickly replaced with agonizing pain. Greg has multiple internal injuries and his leg has been broken in 6 different places. In particular, Greg's ankles were giving him immense pain. He knew he needed to take his boots off, but due to his injuries, was unable to reach and remove them himself. Worried about gangrene, Greg dragged himself to a nearby tree and leaned against it. He attempted to take his shoes off using a stick. It took an agonizing 2.5 hours, but he got the shoes off and felt relief. Greg reluctantly began dragging himself back to the plane as he needed some sort of shade from the African heat, which had reached 43 degrees Celsius. As he is doing this, Greg hears the sounds of a nearby elephant herd heading towards him. Immediately, Greg is concerned. Unable to move away quickly, Greg is worried the herd may notice him too late, get spooked, and attack, trampling him. The elephants were making a tremendous amount of noise as they approached him. Fortunately, the herd eventually moves on, away from Greg, and he completes his crawl to the plane, finding shelter. As a conservationist, Greg recognizes the footfalls of all animals in the African bush. It's at this time he hears the footfalls of a predator walking nearby. A lion is approaching Greg's crash site. Greg knows his only defense is to make noise at the right time, scaring off the predator. As the lion approaches, Greg makes his move. He repeatedly bangs on the plane with a stick. The lion is spooked and runs away. Greg manages to avoid becoming the lion's next meal. Night quickly approaches, which means the ever-looming threat of predators increases. Greg was fighting to stay awake. He knew if he fell asleep, he wouldn't wake up again. Daylight arrives. Greg has survived the night alone in the African bush. It's almost been 24 hours since he crashed his plane. Soon after, Greg hears the sound of a search plane. It isn't the first time Greg has heard this, but he isn't sure if it's really there or if it's his mind playing tricks on him. Either way, Greg picks up a piece of wreckage from the plane and waves it in the air, hoping it will reflect the light and the search plane will notice him. The sound of the plane fades and Greg drops in despair. Soon after this, Greg once again hears footfalls. Only this time, they are human. Greg was rescued, He survived. He had to undergo over 100 operations to save his legs. After a very long road to recovery, Greg learned to walk again. He has not flown an ultralight plane again.